Next up, we have Dr. Paul Tranter, who is the Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales in Canberra. Dr. Tranter's research has made a pioneering contribution in the areas of child-friendly environments, active transport, and healthy and sustainable cities. His paper, Active Travel, A Cure for the Hurry Virus, discusses the dilemma of travelling faster in order to cope with everyday time pressures and how this can lead to a loss of time, of money and health. His work also focuses on creating communities for children and busy parents. Can you please welcome Dr. Paul Tranter from Canberra, Australia to Bendigo, Australia.
Thank you everybody for turning up today. It's a delight to be here with you in Bendigo, and I suspect that just about everyone in this room will be able to relate personally to this session, because we all experience some degree of time pressure in our lives, some degree of busyness in our lives, a sense that we're always in a hurry, that we've never got time to do the things that we want to do, or at least to do them well, and that the next task is always more important than the present. Now, somebody who's talked a lot about time pressure is Carl Honore, who's written this wonderful book in praise of slow. And it's got some great chapters. It's got slow cities, slow food, slow sex, and then a chapter on children, raising an unhurried child. In this chapter, he's got this fantastic quote where he says, "Children are not born obsessed with speed and productivity. We make them that way." And as I was reading this chapter, I started to feel really guilty when I read that the most common phrase that Carl Honore had used when he was bringing up his own children was, "Hurry up. Come on, hurry up, get in the car, we'll be late. Quick, come on." Now, instead of telling children to hurry up all the time and engaging your children in all these extracurricular, adult organised, stimulating activities, that's a very stressful sort of thing for children to be involved in. So what they need instead is unstructured play. And unstructured play, it's not football, it's not ballet, it's exploring the world and your own reaction to it at your own pace. And adults could do with a fair bit of that as well. But instead, a lot of us have very stressful, hectic lives. Now, could I ask you all just to imagine yourself in a situation, this may not be too hard for some of you, imagine that you've got a stressful, hectic life, that your time management is all out of control. You've got to get up early in the morning, you've got to get the children out of bed, you've got to get the children to school, you've got to drive the mother-in-law to the dentist, you've got to pick up the children from after-school care, you've got to get the takeaway food, you've got to drive to the gym, you've got to drive Mary to soccer and Johnny to ballet, and finally, you drive to yoga. But the problem is, you can never get things done fast enough, and you can never get to places quickly enough. And you think that the solution to this is to buy yourself a new car. But you don't just want any new car, you want the fastest new car in Australia. Now, I'm about to show you a picture of the fastest new car in Australia. You may be surprised. There it is. It's the Suzuki Alto. You'll understand why it's the fastest new car in a little while. But before we look at why it's the fastest new car, I want to ask a series of questions. Number one, is it possible that our reliance on supposedly fast modes of transport might simply exacerbate time pressures? Or to put it another way, could slowing down our lives possibly save us time? Or to put it yet another way, could walking and cycling in public transport, instead of driving, reduce the level of time pressure we have? Now, in the next few minutes, I'm going to explain a paradox, the speed paradox. A paradox that speed doesn't always save us time. Sometimes speed steals our time, steals our money, and steals our health. So are we fooling ourselves with the idea that using machines like cars can save us time? Well, let me tell you a little story about the machine that saves you time. Just say you live in a village and it's your job every day to walk to the river and get a bucket of water, and that takes you 1 hour every day. But you're a genius, so you build this machine, it's a bit like this, and all you need to do is pull a lever and the machine takes the bucket down to the river, fills it and brings it back, and you've saved yourself an hour every day. But there's a catch, and the catch is, to make the machine work, you have to spend an hour every day winding up the spring. So the obvious question we need to ask is, should we consider the time spent winding up the spring in order to determine whether this machine is worth having? Now, clearly the answer is yes. In our society, we don't wind up springs, but the equivalent of winding up springs is the time we spend at work to earn the money to pay for all the costs of our time-saving machines. And if you can understand that concept, then you'll understand the concept of effective speed, which takes into account the entire time costs associated with any mode of transport. So for a car driver, it's not just the time spent driving, it's the time spent earning the money to pay for the car, the fuel, the registration, the parking and so on, plus all the external costs, the traffic congestion costs, the pollution costs and so on. This is not a particularly new idea. Ivan Illich, in his 1974 book, Energy Inequity, described, and I've got to say in a rather sexist way, how this applies to American car drivers. So he explained that the typical American male, and in case you're wondering, there's a picture of the typical American male from the 1970s. So the typical American male, he spends 1,600 hours a year on the car. That's 4 of your 16 waking hours either earning the money to pay for the car or driving the car. And if you look at that, that's 1,600 hours to get 7,500 miles, or less than 5 miles per hour in terms of effective speed. And that was the 1970s. Cars are more affordable now, so let's have a look at some estimates of effective speed for car drivers now. And we'll look at single occupant car driving, or DODOs, as Frank Fisher from Melbourne used to call them. DODO stands for driver only, driver owned, and that's what you mainly see in cities. We'll look at average incomes, and we'll look at the direct cost, the cost that you and I would pay if we owned and operated a car, as well as the external costs, some estimates of the external costs. And that's what we come up with. Can you see those figures there? Now, if you look at those figures, they're estimates for the effective speeds for the fastest new car in cities throughout the world. In all of those cities, a fit cyclist would be faster than the fastest new car, and in the bottom 2 or 3 of those cities, a fit pedestrian would be faster than the fastest new car. Now, can the slower active modes of transport actually save us time? In some situations, you don't even have to understand effective speed. This cyclist is faster than the car. The cyclist is moving, the people in the Mercedes are not moving. So, in congested traffic, clearly, walking and cycling can be faster than the car. When you look at an entire city, in cities where walking and cycling and public transport are major modes, people spend less time travelling within the city per day than in cities where cars are the major mode. And you can understand that when you look at travel time budgets and you can compare Western European cities with North American cities. Western European cities, there's lots of public transport, there's lots of cycling. North American cities, there's not much public transport, there's not much cycling. Yet, in the North American cities, even though they're travelling faster, they're still spending more time travelling per day. So the Western European cities, they're not going very fast, only averaging 29 kilometres per hour, but everything's closer to them. It's a bit like the 10-minute neighbourhood. So they're only spending 43 minutes per day travelling. The North American cities, yes, they're travelling a lot faster, but they have to travel a lot further, so they're consequently spending 55 minutes per day travelling. So that increased speed isn't used to cover more distance, so it's to save more time, it's to use to cover more distance. And as more and more people get cars and they're trying to travel faster and faster, that leads to the closure of local schools and shops, like milk bars, and services like post offices, so we've got to travel further to get to those places. So consequently, the car-dominated cities pay for their speed with longer travel times. So we've had a bit of a look at the speed paradox. Now let's apply that to children. Could walking and cycling your children to school actually save you time? Well, to answer that, let's compare 2 scenarios. The first scenario, all the households save time. They save lots of time by driving their kids to school, driving their kids to ballet, driving their kids to soccer, driving their kids to their friends, and there's lots of cars. In scenario B, the children walk or cycle to school and there's very few cars. So let's compare these 2 scenarios. The first thing you've got to remember in scenario A is that parents have got to spend a lot of time at work winding up the spring. Okay? They've got to spend a lot of time earning the money to pay for their cars. If you've got the fastest new car in Australia and you're on an average income, you're spending about an hour a day earning the money to pay for the car. If you stop the argument there, you'll realise the car drivers are wasting their time. But there's more. The kids aren't getting any exercise walking or cycling to school, so the parents now feel obliged to drive them to organised sport. Because the parents are worried about all sorts of safety concerns, all extra cars on the road, the stranger danger, and because the children don't know where their friends live, they've got to be driven to their friends' places. The parents expose their children to more pollution, including in-car pollution, which is a major health risk. And the next one is drawing a slightly longer bow, but we could argue that when the children get older, you're more likely to have to drive them to the doctor or the psychologist because they're going to be fatter and sicker and sadder. So the collective impact of saving time with their cars is that the parents are trapped into a situation where they spend half their life driving their kids around. Scenario B, children walk to school. You don't have to drive into sport because the local neighbourhood is safe enough for the children to play locally. They've got contact with nature and local friends, and that's really good for their health, as is the sense that they feel part of the local community. So because of that, they're fitter, they're happier, they're healthier, and they're smarter. Now, one huge study in Denmark found that when children walked or cycled to school, they did better at school. They performed better at school, and that effect was far greater than the effect of whether they'd had breakfast or not. So these parents who engage their children in all these extracurricular tutoring activities, they'd be better off saving their money and just finding a way for their children to walk and cycle to school. The parents get to work by the active modes, which can have higher effective speeds than the cars anyway. They don't use their cars very often, and when they do, they carpool. They don't have to spend as much time earning the money to pay for, say, the second car, so they can retire earlier, or they can have longer holidays. And they haven't got to drive their children to other places like sport as often, because the children can get around by themselves. So paradoxically, walking and cycling to school can save us time. So how do we create communities for children and for busy parents? And this is what I've been looking at for about 20 years, this topic of child-friendly cities, child-friendly environments. There's two really important features of child-friendly cities. The first is that children should have the freedom to playfully explore their environment in increasing circles as they mature without the threats of traffic danger, stranger danger, pollution and any other sort of danger. And related to that is the idea that they should have a sense of connection. They should feel an important and a valued part of the local community. Unfortunately, we're going backwards in Australia and many other places, and you can see this when you look at data on how children get to school now compared to 2 or 3 decades ago. This is data from Essendon in Melbourne, and you can see between 1974 and 2005 there was a huge jump in the number of children who were driven to school, a huge decline in the number who were walking and using public transport. The only bit of good news here is that the number of children cycling has stayed the same at 1%. So what we've done is we've replaced children's freedom and their playful activity with adult-dependent mobility, and that's got a number of negative impacts for the children and for the parents. How do we actually create more child-friendly cities and in doing so reduce time pressures on parents? Well, here's a few suggestions. They're either related to changing the built environment or changing our social values. An obvious one is to have more local shops and schools and services. And if these are closer to where children live, they're much more likely to be allowed to walk and cycle. Now, what's happening, of course, in Australia and many other places is that we're closing these. We've got to stop doing that. We need to create infrastructure for the active modes. Now, the child-friendly modes are walking, cycling, maybe scooters and public transport. And these are the child-friendly modes for 3 reasons. The first reason, children can use them independently. Okay? It gives them the freedom to explore the city independently. The second reason is that these are the modes that children choose if they're given the choice. The City of Greater Bendigo has done some surveys, and similar surveys have been done in the rest of the world, that show if you ask children, how do you want to get to school, they don't say, I want to be driven. The majority of them say, I want to walk, I want to cycle, or in this case, I want to use my scooter. And the third reason is really important as well. If more adults walk and cycle, or use public transport, that doesn't make the city less child-friendly. The more adults we have walking and cycling, the more conducive it is for children to use those modes. Another obvious one, secure cycle parking in schools, hospitals, shopping centres, makes it much more likely that people will cycle. We need to keep children safe from traffic, and we have made a start in Australia by reducing speed limits from 60 to 50, and in some cases to 40 kilometres an hour. People from Europe come out here and they just laugh at us. They say, you've got to be kidding, 50 kilometres an hour is not slow. Go to Berlin, where more than 70% of the streets have speed limits of 30 kilometres an hour or lower, much more child-friendly. We'll go to Graz in Austria, where the entire city has a speed limit of 30 kilometres an hour, except for some of the main roads where you can do 50. Graz is a really interesting story because when the planners and the politicians wanted to introduce this 30 kilometre hour limit, the residents of Graz said, no, we don't want it. The politicians and the planners said, we're going to do it anyway. They took a risk. They did it, and now the majority of residents, including the majority of motorists, think it's a great idea. It's safer, it's quieter, it's less polluted, it's more child-friendly, it's more livable. The important point was that they took a risk. And as Enrique Penaloza, the previous mayor of Bogota, explains, new visions don't always start with majority support. Sometimes you've got to take a risk to implement them. As well as traffic safety, we also need to think about children's feelings of connections with their neighbourhood and community. And there's certain streetscapes that we should avoid. This is a street in outer Melbourne. That's one side of the street. That's the other side of the street. It's not child-friendly, it's not people-friendly. What we need instead is streetscapes that look more like this. Streetscapes with low front verandas, low front fences that encourage an interaction between the street and the housing. What about changes in social values? There's a couple of things that I think are important here. We need to get people to recognise the collective impact of all their individual decisions, so think collectively rather than as individuals, and we need to slow down. Not just slow down our lives, but slow down our whole community. A lot of parents drive their children to school to protect them from the traffic dangers created by the parents who drive their children to school. So we've got to get parents to realise that that's a ridiculous thing to do, and we need to help them break out of those social traps, get a collective agreement to look after everyone's children. We can do that with an idea that Vic Health has come up with, a Walk Together group, and there's an interesting website on the Victoria Walks website. The other thing we need to do is slow down our whole lives. Now, I was surprised and very excited when I saw these signs appear at the Australian Defence Force Academy. 20 kilometres an hour, except it's 15 past marching troops. And I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could see that sign in every residential street, even if we had 30 at the top, and at the bottom, instead of past marching troops, it said past playful children. That would be a great thing. Playful children, can we get insights about how to design better cities for playful children? Look at these children here, they're not constantly looking at their watches thinking, let's hurry up and finish this game, we've got to get on with the next task. They're completely engaged in what they're doing. So, by way of conclusion, I'd like to just talk about some lessons that we as adults can learn from children. Sometimes we as adults feel overwhelmed by the challenges of creating more livable cities. We need a major cultural transformation in the way we live our lives and the way we design our cities. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, I think all we need to do is observe our children at play and to rediscover some of the values that we used to have as children. So if we do that, we might rediscover the joys of slowness. Children are really good at living in the present. We need to be able to do that as well. We need to rediscover the value of community and working together. We have to work together as a community to solve these problems. And if you look at children at play, they're really good at cooperative play. We also, and I think this is the most important one, we need to rediscover our willingness to take risks and to try new ways of doing things. For example, why don't we take the risk of selling the second car and trying life with just one car? Why don't we take the risk of trialling a 30km/h speed zone in Bendigo? You know, if we can do all these sorts of things, we will create more child-friendly cities. But we'll also have cities that are healthier, happier, and more livable for all city residents. Just leave you with this takeaway point. Creating communities for children of busy parents, it's easy. It's child's play. Thank you very much.